Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Libyan opposition forces storm Gaddafi's al-Aziziya compound and destroy his fist-crushing U.S. plane sculpture as a defiant Saif al-Islam reemerges in Tripoli. Mosaic World News from the Middle East begins now.
Reports indicate that hundreds of Libyan opposition forces stormed Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi's residence at the al-Aziziya compound after hours of fierce fighting. The opposition achieved more military gains in the east and took control of the port of Ras al-Nouf, pushing Gaddafi's supporters to the outskirts of Bin Jawad. In a surprising move, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi appeared in front of the media last night, affirming that his father and his family are still in Tripoli.
The story of Saif al-Islam's arrest and Muhammad al-Gaddafi's escape after being captured in his home has fallen apart. It seems that Gaddafi himself is still far from reach in a safe hideout, if his son Saif al-Islam was telling the truth. Perhaps this explains NATO's intensive bombing of al-Aziziya in the hopes of weakening the resistance and forcing the top Libyan leaders out of their hideouts.
لا تزال عملياتنا في ليبيا متواصلة على مدار اليوم بقصد حماية المدنيين.
Our operations in Libya continue today in order to protect the civilians from surprise attacks by Gaddafi's troops and to impose the no-fly zone. As for the situation in Tripoli, I cannot comment on the military operation currently ongoing there. But we are on alert and are following the situation closely, and we're doing all we can to protect the civilians.
ونقوم بكل ما في وسعنا لحماية المدنيين.
In addition to the intensified airstrikes, reports indicate there is fighting at the al-Aziziya gates, which confirms that NATO's air operations are in coordination with the opposition fighters' movements on the ground. It seems that after the blunder yesterday that complicated the events, the Allied opposition and NATO are seeking a final resolution to the matter. The morning news of the arrest of Gaddafi's son and right-hand man, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, was refuted by his triumphant night tour in the streets of Tripoli as a free man. The day passed with a roller coaster of emotions, from the ecstasy of a rapid triumph to uneasiness over the violent and stubborn resistance.
First, they made swift progress. Second, their losses were extremely limited when compared to the worst-case scenario that we prepared for.
The International Criminal Court scrambled today to deny responsibility for spreading the news of Saif al-Islam's arrest. It placed responsibility on the Libyan opposition and raised questions about its credibility. However, there are certain facts that have been confirmed by audio and video clips, news agencies, and Western sources, such as the White House and NATO countries. The opposition forces took control of 90% of the capital, Tripoli. But the opposition says the battle will not end until the capture of Gaddafi himself.
Gaddafi's regime is isolated and besieged, but it has not collapsed yet.
Gaddafi's loyalists in the capital still control al-Aziziya and the surrounding areas of Hotel Rixos. The developments are accelerating towards a decisive moment. Nasser Farghali, BBC.
As Libyan revolutionary forces overrun Muammar Gaddafi's fortified al-Aziziya compound, it's become more clear that Gaddafi's end is near. What lies ahead for Libya? I'm Homa Lesgi, and this is another edition of News Analysis.
Libyan revolutionaries capture the last stronghold of longtime ruler Muammar Gaddafi in Tripoli, the heavy fortified al-Aziziya compound. The revolutionaries have fought bloody battles with the Gaddafi loyalists to capture the compound. The whereabouts of Gaddafi and his son Saif al-Islam are still unknown. Saif al-Islam was earlier seen in a video in Tripoli. Gaddafi is also said to be in the Libyan capital. Hours before the fall of al-Aziziya, Gaddafi and Saif al-Islam were still defiant and confident of winning. However, all signs now show that the regime is just hours away from full collapse.
Okay, I'd just like to welcome Mr. Abayomi Azikiwe. He's editor of Pan-African Newswire, just joining us from Detroit. Let's get him into the discussion as well. Mr. Azikiwe, I'd like to have your view on why you think we are seeing the events taking place in Libya. My first question to our guests was, how are you explaining the somewhat rapid fall of Tripoli? Of course, not totally, but very near now.
Well, first of all, we've been getting conflicting reports coming out of Tripoli over the last 3 days. We do know that NATO had escalated the bombing operations against Tripoli and the suburbs beginning on Saturday evening. There's also been reports that numerous opposition fighters were unloaded from a ship off the coast of Tripoli to stream into the capital on Saturday evening and early Sunday morning. There were numerous reports that Green Square had fallen and that a large portion of the city had been occupied by the TNC forces. Also, the reports about the capture of Gaddafi's son. Many of these reports have turned out to be false. We see very clearly that the Libyan Defense Forces, as well as the militias, are putting up a formidable resistance to the entry of the rebel forces into the capital. We also know that, according to the New York Times yesterday, NATO, through their precision airstrikes, actually paved the way for these rebels to enter Tripoli since Saturday. Also, in the London Telegraph today, they admit, and we've talked about this for the last several months, that British special forces as well as French special forces have been operating hand in glove with the TNC rebels in order to arm them, train them, and coordinate their activities. And this Operation Mermaid Dawn was actually drafted some 2.5 months ago. The idea was to spark some type of uprising in Tripoli. But in terms of the compound, that compound has been bombed numerous times over the last several months by the NATO forces. It was bombed also again today.
An American lawmaker has warned that Washington will cut its annual $2 billion assistance to Egypt if it withdraws from a peace treaty with Israel. Congresswoman Kay Granger's comments come amid rising tensions between Cairo and Tel Aviv over Israel's killing of several Egyptian security forces last week. Granger also said the extent to which the Muslim Brotherhood is involved in the new Egyptian government will impact the U.S. assistance. Cairo has been receiving close to $2 billion in aid every year from Washington since the 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel.
سيف الإسلام القذافي هذا هو النبأ الذي طغى مع ساعات الليل.
Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi's appearance dominated the news last night about the Libyan capital. The story emerged late at night when a group of Gaddafi loyalists transported 3 journalists to the Bab al-Aziziya compound where the son of the Libyan colonel was waiting for them. He was assumed to have been arrested 2 days ago, according to the Libyan Transitional Council. Saif al-Islam spoke to journalists, then accompanied them on a visit to the Rixos Hotel, where foreign media correspondents are staying. Saif al-Islam held another tour, and images were captured as he greeted his supporters who had gathered to meet him. He was recorded stating that he appeared in order to disprove rumors of his arrest and confirm that Tripoli is still under the control of the regime.
أولاً تفنيد لكل الإشاعات والكلام.
First of all, I'm here to refute all the rumors and reports. NATO used its most sophisticated technology to block all our communications. They sent text messages to the Libyan people. They interrupted our TV broadcast. They waged an electronic media war against us to scare our people. They also sent gangs and armed groups to Tripoli by sea and civilian vehicles to create chaos.
وشفتوا كيف الشعب الليبي هب بالكامل
You saw how the Libyan people, men and women, rose up yesterday and today and broke the backs of the rebels and the rats and the gangs. I'm going on a tour of Tripoli now and we'll visit all the hotspots. You will see everything is normal and we will reassure the entire world that the situation in Libya is great, thank God.
Doctor, everyone is talking about Tripoli.
Okay, we will now take a tour of the city of Tripoli. We will visit areas that they say are witnessing fierce battles.
Doctor, they say they will hand you over to the criminal court.
Screw the criminal court.
Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, announced the arrest of Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, for whom the ICC had issued an arrest warrant on charges of crimes against humanity. Ocampo expressed his hope that Saif al-Islam would soon be extradited to Holland for his trial in The Hague. 39-year-old Saif al-Islam appeared to be following in his father's steps. Contrary to what was said about his political openness, he made heated statements condemning the revolution.
For years, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi played a prominent role in the political life of his father's regime without any official position. Saif al-Islam, the oldest son of Gaddafi's second wife, was born in Tripoli on June 25, 1972. He is the second oldest of Gaddafi's 8 children. In 1995, he obtained a degree in architectural engineering from Tripoli's Al-Fateh University and a PhD from the London School of Economics. He began his political activities outside Libya in 2000, when he attended negotiations over the release of Western hostages in the Philippines. In 1997, he established the Gaddafi International Foundation for Charity Associations. He acted as mediator in the case involving Bulgarian nurses who spent 8 years in Libyan prisons and helped release them in 2007. He took part in negotiations regarding compensating the families of victims of the commercial plane crash in Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. He also pushed for compensations to the victims of the UTA flight that crashed in Niger a year later. Saif al-Islam wanted to introduce his country to private media networks and succeeded in 2007 when Libya's first private television channel and 2 newspapers were launched. However, in 2009, they were either nationalized or shut down. Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi's anticipated presence in the criminal court will be the first of its kind for the Arab dictatorial regimes.
Historically, the fate and destiny of different peoples has been similar in some parts of the world because of their rulers. We are talking about arrogant tyrants and those who take pride in oppressing, killing, and terrorizing others.
The situation did not last long for Muammar al-Gaddafi, whose people rose up and overnight displayed their will to liberate themselves from tyranny. To a large extent, his case is similar to that of the buried tyrant Saddam, who also claimed to be immortal, the only leader, irreplaceable, and said he would never give up his throne. However, the will of the free Iraqi people was stronger.
People agree that tyrants don't last forever. Today, we can also agree that they share the same fate. The lives of Saddam and Gaddafi featured similarities, and so did their end, with both of their pictures stepped on and hit with shoes. During their lives, they pursued power and went after earthly pleasures while starving their people and ignoring nation-building and development projects to the detriment of millions of victims. Photos of the 2 tyrants characterized the streets of their cities and provinces and bore witness to the end of their rule. After the streets were emptied of these landmarks, they were filled with Ba'ath Party militias in Iraq and battalions in the great socialist people's Libyan Jamahiriya. Al-Gaddafi laid out his vision in the Green Book, which was used as the state's constitution. As for Saddam, he engaged with the celestial world and invoked the prayers that were broadcast on TV after each program. Saddam's rule was most known for his principle of never leave your enemy behind, beat him and place him in front of you. This principle still has no explanation. Even Saddam could not explain it. Despite the fact that al-Gaddafi's family members outnumber those of Saddam, they all took the same path as if their fathers advised them to. The tyrant's children became army commanders, heads of sports clubs and federations, knights of immorality and nightlife, and alcohol and drug addicts. It is worth mentioning that both states punished such addicts with the death penalty. They were stylish when giving great speeches, then appeared bearded as they flirted with al-Qaeda and its lackeys. Saddam was found in a forgotten hole on the banks of Daja in the region of Dor, and his end came at the hands of the people. He received the death penalty for crimes against humanity. As for Gaddafi, he has already predicted the same end.
An Arab hand kills and executes, and we just watch. Why? Tomorrow it will be your turn, all of you.
The UN Human Rights Council has adopted a draft resolution calling for the formation of an independent committee to investigate human rights violations in Syria.
The draft resolution was proposed by the US, the EU, and the 4 Arab countries at the Council: Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Kuwait. Meanwhile, Russia, China, and Cuba have opposed the resolution.
The Syrian opposition held a press conference in Istanbul to announce the outcome of their meeting aimed at forming a national council to represent the opposition inside and outside Syria.
On the ground, the UN team has arrived in the city of Idlib. The visit coincided with a protest rally that was held on city streets demanding the downfall of the regime.
The Syrian Revolution Coordination Union said that the army has withdrawn from Harasta in Rif Dimashq after storming the city at dawn.
رصاص فمدرعات واقتحامات والنتيجة دماء وقتلى.
Gunfire, tanks, and raids on one side, and blood, death, funerals, and more protests on the other. This is the dominant scene in Syria. Since March 15th, Syria has been witnessing bloody days. Funeral processions are being held today, from Daraa in the south to Idlib in the north, and from al-Bukamal and Deir ez-Zor in the east, passing through Homs and ending at the coastal cities.
شرقا مرورا بحمص وصولا إلى المدن الساحلية. وهنا في جسر الشغور حيث سربت هذه الصور حديثا.
These images, which have recently surfaced from Jisr al-Shugur, bring back to memory the era of ignorance, which many thought had long passed, as cited by activists. Ignorance, which is not limited by time or place, reflects the low morals of some, described as defenders of the homeland front. Meanwhile, Homs's cities and villages are still being placed under siege and witnessing military operations, and the death tolls continue to rise. The situation is similar in Latakia, al-Bukamal, and other Syrian cities. Under the dark shadow of night, this military convoy is rushing to the area of al-Qoriya and Deir ez-Zor, where security forces are conducting sweeps and raids. The campaign is also targeting the city of Harasta in Rif Dimashq and other villages in Rif Hama.
في دمشق ولا قرى ريف حما.
These protesters are no longer frightened by the sound of gunfire and shelling. After performing the Tarawiyah prayer in the area of Binish in Idlib, Ibrahim joins the night protests calling for the downfall of the regime. In Babi Hud and Rustin in Homs, the protests often turn into popular celebrations, calling for freedom and the ouster of Assad. This is Syria, where activists launched the Freedom Revolution. They are gaining new momentum from Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, vowing to continue with steadfastness and announce their complete separation from a regime that will not last forever.
Regional news, maintaining a diplomatic presence in Tel Aviv is in Cairo's best interest, and the recalling of the Egyptian ambassador was never considered, despite media reports to the contrary. This, according to Egyptian Foreign Minister Mohammed Kamel Amr. Egyptian newspapers carried reports last weekend indicating that Egypt would withdraw its envoy in protest over the deaths of 5 Egyptian soldiers along the border on Thursday, as Israel pursued terrorists who launched an attack from the Sinai Desert. In a related development, Arab League Secretary General Amr Musa Abil The Secretary General Albil al-Mawarabi today condemned the removal of Israel's national flag by protesters at the embassy in Cairo. According to the Arab League official, no one has the right to do such a thing. Egypt's ruling military council today indicated willingness to replace Israel's flag in accordance with international law that requires all nations to protect embassies located in their countries. Rockets fired from Gaza this morning hit the Ashkelon Regional Council, sparking a blaze that firefighting and rescue teams were eventually able to extinguish. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro paid a visit to the Kaplan Medical Center in Rehovot, where 7 people injured in Palestinian-fired missile attacks from Gaza over the weekend remain hospitalized. Among the wounded is an American citizen, as well as a Palestinian resident of the territories who was illegally in Israel without a work permit when he was wounded by shrapnel. The U.S. ambassador had harsh words for the Hamas terror organization, and he told Israel Television's Vered Pelman that the United States supports Israel's right to defend itself.
The message for Hamas is that terrorism of all kinds is completely unacceptable by all civilized people. There's no excuse, there's never a justification for attacks against civilians like we saw on the Rote Lot or like we saw in the missile attacks that wounded the people here in this hospital. And we reject it, and we will never accept that kind of behavior. Israel has a right to defend itself against those kinds of attacks. Israel has suffered far too long from them, so we'll continue to work closely with Israel, with other governments and other countries in the region and beyond to try to bring an end to these kinds of attacks.
The Palestinians will pay a price if they go forward with plans to declare statehood in September without having achieved a political agreement with Israel. That's the view of U.S. Republican Congressional Majority Leader Eric Cantor, who also said that the United States does not consider Hamas to be the legitimate ruler of Gaza.
We do not believe that we should be funding an entity that moves forward in the United Nations unilaterally like that, because it essentially obviates all the agreements, all the paths to peace that have been negotiated in the past. And that's why we object so strenuously to that move. The other line in the sand for us is certainly the PA's alliance with Hamas. The United States views Hamas as a terrorist organization. It is an organization that does not value life and targets innocent people. That is another line in the sand for us that we will not support with U.S. taxpayer dollars from the congressional standpoint, any type of alliance like that. There is no question America would not tolerate rockets being launched against our citizenry, and that is why I personally understand and support the Israeli Defense Forces moves to take out the individuals and entities that perpetrated these terrorist attacks and that killed innocent civilians in this country. While we've been here, we have had briefings on the Iron Dome program, very impressed with its efficacy, and is something that we believe has saved lives. And after all, I think that our alliance with Israel is based on the respect for life, and unfortunately, innocent people have died because of the terrorist attacks.
Algeria's third batch of humanitarian aid was sent to the Horn of Africa countries, which have been swept by a wave of drought and famine. This comes as relief supplies are being airlifted from the Bufarik military airport toward Nairobi International Airport in Kenya. The value of the humanitarian aid ordered by the President of the Republic was estimated at $10 million, including $3 million allocated to Dadaab refugee camp. The Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya is one of the Kenyan camps credited for saving the lives of thousands of refugees escaping famine, drought, and war. However, the situation is deteriorating due to an enormous daily influx of refugees to the camp. Taima Asafir reports.
Approximately 1,500 Somali refugees cross the Kenya-Somalia border every day on their way to Dadaab refugee camp located near the border. There they join other refugees who have been living in the camp for years. Dadaab is the largest refugee camp in the world. The Kenyan government opened the camp in 1991 as a temporary solution to the civil war in Somalia. At the time, it was built to hold 90,000 refugees, but after 20 years and the waves of drought that have struck the Horn of Africa, the camp is now sheltering over 600,000 refugees. This number far exceeds the capacity of the camp, leading to strained relations between the refugees that are negatively affected by the way the aid is distributed.
The mission sometimes becomes complicated because refugees fight over aid, which we can say has become limited due to the increasing number of refugees here.
The process of receiving refugees begins with a health check followed by registration, and some of them receive tents to shelter them 15 days later. The rest of them, about 60,000, are still on the waiting list. They build their homes with plastic sheets outside the camp. Their situation here is not significantly better than it was in their own country, which has prompted the Kenyan government to allow the UN Refugee Agency to expand the camp. While World Food Programme is working to provide food, the question remains, for how long will this situation continue?
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world.